These are some highlights from the amazing life story of Curt Herzstark, mostly taken from a long interview with Curt himself that was conducted by Erwin Tomasz from the Charles Babbage Institute in September 1987, about a year before Curt died. I'm just going to give you a few moments, but it's worth reading the whole thing. I'll put a link down there. I decided not to use the usual historical photographs you see in stories like this, so it'll be mostly Curta footage. The Buchenwald concentration camp was one of the first and one of the largest Nazi camps. About 300,000 prisoners were held there, and about a fourth of them died there. In the days after the camp was liberated, General George Patton was there for a few days. Legendary journalist Edward R. Murrow was there for a few days. And Curt Herzstark, inventor of the Curta calculator, was there too. Curt had been walked into Buchenwald by SS officers and dogs. And over a year later, Curt walked out alone. Curt was born as a baby in 1902 in Vienna, Austria, the son of Samuel Herzstark, a Jewish engineer who had his own adding machine factory. Curt left school early to work for the Herzstark company, and by his 20s he was already a major player. He would drive all over Europe, demonstrating the machines, repairing broken machines, even coming up with some original designs of his own. Curt says it was in the late 1920s that he started hearing requests for small machines, and his ideas for the Curta started to take shape. Over the next 10 years or so, he worked on it as a side project, and by 1937 he had the basic form factor settled, and he even built a prototype that could add and subtract. Curt was all ready to get serious about producing this thing in the Herzstark factory, but less than 6 months later, Austria officially became part of Nazi Germany. After living in Buchenwald for about a year, Curt was sent to a totally different facility, an underground factory building bombs for the V-1 and V-2 rockets. Curt and a small group of other prisoners lived over there for a couple of months in early 1945 in relative safety, fixing up the machinery. Meanwhile, the Americans were closing in on Buchenwald, and the Nazis knew they wouldn't be able to hold it. There were plans to completely destroy the camp before leaving, but instead they just marched the prisoners out, eventually to other camps. Most of those evacuated prisoners didn't survive. And as those prisoners were marching down the road away from Buchenwald, Curt and his group got marched back to Buchenwald. The guys in charge of Curt's group weren't real SS. They were like local guys, old men with dogs and hunting rifles. And they hadn't been told that the camp was being evacuated. So Curt's group of about 40 actually passed hundreds of prisoners on the road walking the other way. He says they yelled back and forth to each other, like, "Where are you guys going?" Nobody knew what was going on. When Curt's group made it back to Buchenwald, the place was mostly empty. There were still a lot of prisoners, but not many guards. And a few days later, the Americans arrived. It only took them a few minutes to clear the place out. Curt remembered the guy sitting in the front seat of the first Jeep. He was chewing gum loudly. He gave Curt a pack of Lucky Strikes. After the war, the old Herzstark business was dead. The family still had the factory, but the infrastructure and the demand in Vienna just couldn't support it. So Curt started looking for foreign companies who could produce the Curta. He got an offer from the Remington Rand company, but it never panned out. Curt was close to making another deal with a Swiss adding machine company called Precisa, but then he got an official invitation to the palace of the Prince of Liechtenstein. Liechtenstein was neutral during the war, and the relatively undamaged country saw an opportunity to become a technical leader in the new Europe. They loved Curt's invention, and they offered him a deal that Precisa couldn't compete with. As it turned out, it was kind of a bad deal, and Curt wound up regretting his choice. The folks in Liechtenstein created a new company called Contina, with Curt as the chief technical director and the Curta as their only product. The first finished units appeared on the market in 1949. Curt left the company 3 years later. As soon as Curt arrived in Buchenwald, he was brought to the guy in charge of the camp's factory. They had a whole file about Curt, his background, his skills in engineering. The camp was running a factory with slave labor from the prisoners, but the head engineer understood that Curt would know the machines better than anyone else on site. The engineer said, "Listen, Herzstark, there's no policing here. You have to take care of yourself, because the sun will shine again one day for you. So Curt was able to avoid the dangerous, exhausting work that killed so many others there. He was allowed to receive letters and packages of food from his mother. During the days, Curt would work on the machines in the factory, keep them running. He was also allowed to bring in other prisoners to help if he thought it was necessary, and Curt ended up inventing a bunch of fake jobs just to keep people safe. From time to time, Curt would talk with others about his history in the adding machine business, and he even told them about his big idea for a small machine. The head engineer called him in when he heard about it. He said, "I can't take you off your day job, but I like the sound of your idea." And so in the evenings in the Buchenwald concentration camp, Curt drew up the first detailed technical designs for the Curta. The boss said it would make a perfect gift for the Führer when the war was over. From the early days, Curt called his machine the Lilliput. That's what it was called in the Buchenwald drawings. But the suits at Cantina didn't like the name. Curt does a great job of describing their arguments over the name, so I'll just quote him. He said, "We do not want any clever, complex, tricky names." He then proceeded to suggest many completely crazy names. They argued about it for a while until one of their salespeople, one of the only women around, spoke up. She said all these names were bad. "The inventor's name is Curt, so we should call it Curta." Good call, lady. Curt left the Cantina company in 1952 and moved back to Vienna. The folks at Cantina had broken a lot of their financial promises, but Curt made enough money to quietly live out the rest of his days with his wife and 2 kids. He says that if he had stayed at Cantina, he would have continued innovating the machine and transitioned to electronics when the time was right. Instead, Cantina sold the Curta for over 2 decades without making any innovations at all, and they promptly went out of business when electronics hit the market. I can't really blame them, but I do wonder about what might have been if Curt was in charge. I don't know if Curt saw it this way, but to me, as an observer separated by time and space, Curt's life story is dominated by 2 images: the Curta calculator and the gates of the Buchenwald concentration camp. And which image is the more powerful, the more enduring? I believe even the gates of hell can't stand forever. Today the gates of Buchenwald are open. The dark soul of that place is gone forever. And the Curta calculator is here in my hand.